Welcome, everybody. My name is Joshua Furman. I am the Associate Director of the program in Jewish Studies at Rice and the curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive. We're so excited to have our first hybrid event and to welcome back to Houston Dr. Avinoam Patt. So excited to have you with us. And those of you who are joining us via Zoom can submit questions for Dr. Patt via the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar, and I will be monitoring those questions and sending them to Dr. Patt for responses. Dr. Patt is the Doris and Simon Konover Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. Previously, he served as the Feltman Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Hartford and as the Miles Lerman Scholar for Jewish Life and Culture at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He is the author of several books, including Finding Home and Homeland, Jewish Youth and Zionism in the Aftermath of the Holocaust, which was published by Wayne State University Press in 2009. And with Michael Berkowitz, he is the co-editor of a collected volume on Jewish displaced persons titled We Are Here, New Approaches to the Study of Jewish Displaced Persons in Post-War Germany. He also co-edited with David Slucky and Gabriel Finder the volume Laughter After, Humor and the Holocaust in April of 2020, among other publications. His newest book, which he is here in Houston today to lecture on, is entitled The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, the Afterlife of the Revolt, and his talk today is entitled Like Sheep to the Slaughter, the Holocaust, Israel, and the Enduring Power of an Image. Please join me in welcoming back to Houston, Dr. Patt.
All right, thank you very much, Josh, and I want to thank Rice Jewish Studies for inviting me and bringing me back to Houston. It's really a pleasure for me to be back. As many of you know, this is my hometown, so and Marilyn Hassett is here, and I think the last time I did a book talk was at the book festival at the JCC in 2009 for my book on Jewish DPs after the Holocaust. So it's very fitting that, and I have to say, so this is the book, The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of the Revolt, which came out last year in 2021. And this is my first in-person book talk. There's been lots of virtual online events via Zoom, but I think it's very fitting that I get to be back in Houston for the first in-person event. So thank you, Josh, and thank you, Rice, for organizing. So I'm going to share my screen here so that the people on the Zoom can see my PowerPoint and everybody in the room, this one, yeah, can see the PowerPoint. So let's just make sure that we can. Good? Okay. You said hide meeting controls, right? That one? All right. Thank you, Kwam. Okay, so as many of you know, I will be speaking tonight on my new book on the afterlife of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, focused specifically on the ways in which Jews around the world made the event the focus of commemoration events within the first years of the revolt, establishing the revolt as the prism through which Jews around the world would remember the Holocaust almost immediately after it occurred. It's quite fitting that as today is Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, which I'll speak more about tonight, that we reflect on how this date came to be the date that would be the central date of remembrance. In the book, I not only examine how and why the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a revolt which commenced on April 19th, 1943, led by poorly armed fighters from the Jewish Fighting Organization, the Jewish Military Union, and thousands of other Jews who burrowed themselves underground in bunkers under the ghetto, resisting deportation from the ghetto for 4 weeks and in some cases more, became the focal point of Holocaust memory for decades after the war. I also ask why, despite representing the best-known case of Jewish resistance during the war, the paradigm of passivity and resistance, of martyrs and heroes, of sheep and warriors, has been such a persistent part of how the Holocaust is remembered. I've been working on this project for the past several years, knowing that the 75th anniversary and now the 80th anniversary of the revolt next year was approaching. And so, of course, I was paying careful attention in April of 2018 to the ways in which the revolt was commemorated 3/4 of a century later. At the 75th anniversary commemoration on April 19th, 2018, at 12 p.m. that day, the noise of a siren echoed across Warsaw. And when it ended, the official commemoration ceremony began in front of the Natan Rappaport statue to the Ghetto fighters, erected 70 years earlier on April 19th, 1948. The state-sanctioned ceremony, which included remarks by the President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, the Israeli ambassador, Anna Azari, and the President of the World Jewish Congress, Ron Lauder, carried the shadow of Poland's February 2018 Holocaust law, which had outlawed any speech that alleged Polish complicity in crimes against Jews during World War II. In his remarks at the ceremony, Duda emphasized that the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto were Polish citizens, that they had, quote, flown both the Jewish blue and white flag as well as the Polish red and white flag, unquote, over the walls of the ghetto during the revolt, that they had received rifles and machine guns from the Polish underground, and that news of the revolt that was broadcast by the BBC had been delivered by the Polish government in exile in London. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, according to Duda, was, quote, an uprising of the people who decided to keep their dignity. They perished for dignity, they perished for freedom, but they perished for Poland because they were Polish citizens. Poles and Jews deeply care about having one shared historical truth. Speaking on behalf of the World Jewish Congress, you can see here Ron Lauder, WJC President Ron Lauder led a delegation of nearly 100 Jewish community representatives from around the world to commemorate the anniversary. In his remarks, standing in front of the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto heroes, Lauder asked, quote, where did they summon the courage to stand up to the Germans? Would any of us have been able to summon this courage? Arguing that it goes beyond human reason to stand up to a much larger army in an impossible fight, Lauder emphasized that, quote, the Jewish fighters of Warsaw did it for the same reasons that Jews at Masada stood up to the Roman legion 2,000 years ago. Something deep inside them finally said, enough, must speak. They refused to die like sheep. This handful of Polish Jews showed a courage that is hard for most people to understand. What these brave young fighters did not know, and what they could not know, is what the effect their actions would have on future generations of Jews and all free people around the world. Echoing the words of the Israeli ambassador, who noted that April 19th, 2018 also coincided with Israel's Independence Day that year, Lauder also noted that, quote, just 5 years after these brave young Polish Jews rose up against Nazi tyranny, the Jewish state of Israel arose from the ashes. The Jewish people lifted themselves up from what was essentially their grave to achieve their 2,000-year-old dream to establish a modern Jewish state in their paternal homeland. And all of this within 5 years of the struggle here in Warsaw. I believe, Lauder said, it was the heroism of the brave young Polish Jews who stood up to the Nazis here that inspired the future young defenders of Israel who defeated armies many times their size. We have seen this heroism and miracles throughout our history, from Moses and his successor Joshua to King David, all the way down to Israeli commandos who stormed the airport at Entebbe to rescue innocent victims of terrorists in 1976. In the end, when they ran out of guns and ammunition, and when they had no alternative, many of them committed suicide rather than be taken by the Germans. We are standing here on the modern-day Masada. This is holy ground. So it is not surprising that Lauder, standing in front of the monument that literally cast in stone the dichotomy between Jewish passivity and resistance, here I'm showing you the back of what the monument looks like. Here's the front and here's the back. It's not surprising that he would draw a connection between the heroism of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters and the creation of the State of Israel, or that the president of the World Jewish Congress would note the history of Jewish bravery that stretched from Moses to Joshua to David, Masada, and Yoni Netanyahu, invoking the contrast between those who died fighting and those who allowed themselves to be led like, quote, sheep to the slaughter. such linkages have become commonplace in Jewish understandings of the meaning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and especially common when the Holocaust is invoked for political reasons. And I'd be happy in the Q&A to talk about the ways in which that's happening in the present day. But it was not self-evident at the time the uprising took place that the revolt would be interpreted through a Zionist lens or be seen as part of the struggle to create the Jewish state. And yet, this framing of the memory of the revolt took place in a battle for memory of the event soon after the revolt occurred. What is the source of this enduring image of sheep to the slaughter? And how did this image reinforce the worldviews of diverse Jewish communities at the time? The answer to this question can help us understand the ways in which the events of the Holocaust have been incorporated into contemporary Jewish understandings of the modern world. Now, broadly speaking, my own work has focused on what are arguably the two most significant events in modern Jewish history, the Shoah and the creation of the State of Israel. And I'm particularly interested in examining the connections between these two events and their place in Jewish history. Now, if you look at historical writing on the Holocaust, and in fact, if you look more broadly at the study of modern Jewish history, one of the interesting things is that it's worth noting that the two major schools of the writing of Jewish history, what we would call the Jerusalem school or the Zionist school of the writing of Jewish history, and the liberal school of the writing of Jewish history, which affirms the possibilities of Jewish life in the diaspora, these schools of thought were in place before the Second World War, and they have not really changed that much since in the aftermath of the Holocaust. What has also become clear is that over several generations of Holocaust research, it has become apparent that many Holocaust scholars have not typically been equipped with sufficient knowledge of Jewish history, communal politics, life, and culture to contribute to a better understanding of the realities of European Jewish life under assault. For those of us who teach the subject, we know that one of the most common questions students will ask is, quote, why did Jews not fight back? A question that we tend to answer with a list of examples of armed resistance rather than an explanation of the many obstacles to resistance. And in recent decades, Israeli-trained scholars have attempted to provide a more nuanced spectrum of Jewish responses from forms of spiritual resistance, education, documentation projects, social welfare activists in the ghettos, and more. Largely in response to works like Rowold Hilberg's The Destruction of European Jews, which focused almost exclusively on how the Germans organized the final solution, generally ignoring Jewish responses and dismissing resistance as inconsequential in stopping the final solution. It would seem clear then that incorporating Jewish sources, looking at Jewish responses and Jewish perspectives would not only add to our understanding of the Shoah, but it would also help us understand the event within the continuities and discontinuities of Jewish history. And one of the things that is quite fascinating is that in this research on Jewish responses to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising suggests that until now, the revolt itself, far from serving as a revolution in Jewish history, ended up confirming the ways in which Zionists, Bundists, diverse American Jewish groups, and others already understood their position in the world. That is to say that if the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising did nothing to change the ways in which Jews understood the meaning and significance of the Holocaust, and then it stands to reason that the Holocaust itself has in fact had little to no impact on the ways in which Jews understand their place in the world. While the revolt in Warsaw would be carried out by a diverse cross-section of Jewish society, Zionists, Bundists, Communists, Hasidim, and thousands of Jews who did not have arms but burrowed themselves into bunkers underground, resisting deportation efforts for weeks afterwards, the broad, complicated nature of this revolt would be subsumed into a Zionist reading of history that saw the event as a step forward in the struggle to create the Jewish state. And in the book, I argue that despite the dedicated efforts of surviving ghetto fighters to make sure their stories were told, the testimonies and reports they drafted during and after the war only served to confirm those historical frameworks in place before the war that would influence writing and documentation projects during and after the war. Instead of challenging Jewish passivity as its paradigmatic diaspora Jewish response to persecution, the revolt served to reinforce this motif that you can see here of sheep to the slaughter. To understand how and why this happened, I'd like to spend my remaining time focusing specifically on the origins of this image, sheep to the slaughter, and to examine the role of ghetto fighters themselves in explaining the meaning and significance of their actions during and after the war, and in shaping a particular collective memory of the Shoah that continues to reverberate in the contemporary world. In November of 1942, after learning of the deportations from Krakow to Belzec, Aaron Dolik Libeskind, a leading member of the pre-war Akiva movement and leader of the Jewish underground in Krakow, called for armed resistance in Krakow, arguing, quote, we are fighting for three lines in history. It will not be said that our youth marched like sheep to the slaughter. The image of Jews marching like sheep to the slaughter was repeated frequently, both during and after the war, as surviving resistance fighters worked to ensure that the legacy of Jewish heroism, in contrast to Jewish passivity, would not be forgotten. In the aftermath, the concept of resistance or revolt was intended to replace the traumatic individual past of the survivors and the collective sense of Jewish passivity in the face of persecution, with shared experience of wartime heroism in the Ghetto Revolt, regardless of what members' experiences had been in the war. In the displaced persons camps, and this is something that I write about in my first book, this practice of lionizing the heroes and disparaging the sheep was also commonplace. So Zionist youth movements in Europe after the war pointed to their central role in organizing the resistance as justifying their post-war leadership of the Jewish public. Here you can see the cover page of a diary that was written by young Holocaust survivors who were organized in a Zionist youth kibbutz after the war, and their kibbutz was named after the Warsaw Ghetto fighter, Tosia Altman, who had perished in 1943. And in fact, one of the things that intrigued me in the time of the writing of the first book is, how did it come to be that they knew about Tosia Altman, that she became the celebrated legendary hero immediately after the revolt had taken place, not years or decades afterwards. In the DP camps, so you can see here, for example, let me just show you, the Hashomeret Zair newspaper from April of 1946, published in the DP camps in Germany, was dedicated to the 3-year anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, announcing that, quote, our movement was among the first to make the call for rebellion. And leaders of the displaced persons spoke about the important function that Warsaw could play in organizing the Jewish public after the war. Within DP society as a whole, political leaders and historical commissions also attempted to elevate the place of the ghetto fighters, as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising enjoyed, quote, an uncomplicated place of honor within the collective memory of the surviving remnant. The valor of the ghetto fighters, the dedication of the underground movements, the heroism of the partisans was marked at every opportunity, as Zev Mankiewicz suggests, as a means of lightening the burden of victimhood and the torment of helplessness. Levi Shalaton, a survivor from Shavli in Lithuania and editor of the DP publication Unser Weg, argued at a meeting to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt in 1946, quote, a people cannot live off Treblinka and Majdanek. Only thanks to Warsaw can these people live on. And so post-war depictions of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising by surviving ghetto fighters likewise contrasted resistance with the, quote, sheep sent to the slaughter. So you can see here, this also comes from the April 1946 publication. On one page, the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto and a dedication to those who led the revolt. And on the second page, let us not go like sheep to the slaughter. After the war, the Yishuv and its emissaries sought to capitalize on the heroism of movement members, and the surviving ghetto fighters themselves also presented the choice to resist as emerging from a place of deep Zionist ideological immersion. This notion of sheep to the slaughter, however, not only exclusive to members of Zionist youth movements, had an important pre-war precedent and was not merely a post-war interpretation by Zionist leaders. So I'll skip ahead here. The phrase itself had its origins in the Psalms and Isaiah, and was also cited in the Talmud, where the phrase was invoked to celebrate acts of Kiddush Hashem, that is, those who died to sanctify the name of God, by Jewish children who refused to be enslaved by the Romans and went willingly to their deaths to sanctify God's name. And you can see that this is not just an Old Testament, it's also a New Testament sort of invocation of a willingness to celebrate martyrdom, those who would be willing to die as sheep sent to the slaughter. Nonetheless, in the context of pogroms which took place in Europe in the 19th century, and more broadly in the development of modern Jewish political movements advocating for Jews to have greater agency over their lives and deaths, the phrase evolved from a celebration of martyrdom to sanctify God's name to a source that evoked the manner in which Jews were degraded and humiliated by such persecutions. In Zionist ideology, the notion of a passive diaspora mentality that needed to be vanquished in the negation of the diaspora was given perhaps its strongest depiction in the work of Chaim Nachman Bialik, who in his famous poem City of Slaughter indicted the victims and indeed the survivors of the 1903 Kishinev pogrom. Concealed and cowering, the sons of the Maccabees, the seeds of saints, the scion of the lions, who crammed by scores in all sanctuaries of their shame, so sanctified my name. It was the flight of mice they fled, the scurrying of roaches was their flight, they died like dogs and they were dead. The pogrom in Kishinev and the seemingly passive response of the Jewish public to the attacks gave rise to bitter indictment, particularly in Zionist circles, of Jewish behavior and the willingness of victims to go to their deaths, quote, with necks outstretched. With the outbreak of violence in Palestine in 1920, leaders of the Yishuv appropriated the term, but this time to indicate that the Zionist pioneers would refuse to go to their deaths passively. Thus, for example, Zalman Rubashov, in the aftermath of the 1920 riots in Palestine, rejected attempts to plead with the British for law and justice. In an article titled, "Will They Make Jerusalem into a Kishinev?" he proclaimed, "The brothers of the Tel Chai heroes will not be led as sheep to the slaughter. The land of Israel will not become a gallows for the people of Israel." Anita Shapira, prominent historian of Israel, also details how the 1929 pogrom in Tzfat was described by the Yishuv press in terms directly lifted from Bialik. As she notes, Haaretz described events in Tzfat as, again, going to the slaughter like sheep. As expressed by Yudka and Chaim Chazaz's story, The Sermon, written in 1942, Jewish diaspora history was nothing but a series of persecutions and oppressions to be ignored and forgotten. As Yudka says in his sermon, it's simply because Jewish history is dull, uninteresting. It has no glory or action, no heroes and conquerors, no rulers and masters of their fate, just a collection of wounded, hunting, groaning, and wailing wretches, always begging for mercy. In Zionist ideology, the notion of diaspora Jewry is passive, depicted as, and these are terms that are used, mice, scurrying roaches, wailing wretches, sheep to the slaughter, exercised a powerful influence on movement members in the Yishuv and the diaspora who sought to elevate their spiritual and historic standing. So during the war, it's clear that this motif of sheep to the slaughter animated the thinking of ghetto fighters and may also have reflected something of the internal struggles about the debate over whether to fight in the ghettos entirely and the relationship between the underground and the broader Jewish public. As part of their educational efforts in the ghettos, youth movements, both Zionist and Jewish Socialist Bundist youth movements, established collective schools, and underground press in ghettos large and small throughout Eastern Europe. And in the first part of the war, many of these movements were actually focused on providing relief to the suffering in the ghetto, not on organizing resistance, which would become a source of bitter regret after the war. And here I'm just showing you some of the figures who played an important role in organizing to maintain morale in the ghettos and provide education. So Tuvia Buzhukovsky is someone I'll talk about more later, very involved in educational efforts in the Warsaw Ghetto before the Uprising. The youth movements, though, began to shift to preparing armed resistance only after receiving reports of systematic slaughters of Jews that were taking place in the East. And nonetheless, this delay in organizing armed resistance proved to be a source of great regret. Abba Kovner, leader of HaShomer HaTzair in Vilna, argued in his December 31st, 1941 manifesto, which called on the Jews of Vilna, again, quote, to not go like sheep to the slaughter, that the Nazi slaughter of the Jews in Lithuania and Poland was not local in nature, but part of an overall systematic plan bent on the total slaughter of the Jews of Europe. Even so, Kovner and his group were unable to convince the Vilna ghetto population to engage in revolt. In Warsaw, too, the Jewish public initially met the reports of systematic extermination skeptically. Marek Edelman of the Jewish Socialist Bund also pointed out one of the crucial challenges that faced the Bund. In order to mount any sort of resistance against the Germans, it was necessary to overcome the passivity, indifference, and apathy of a Jewish public fearful of greater punishment, already beaten into submission by oppression. This mindset, Edelman explained in post-war testimony, also led the Jewish public, the Warsaw Ghetto as a whole, to refuse to believe reports of atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi regime. Quote, we were ashamed of the Chelmno Jews' submissiveness, of their failure to rise in their own defense. We did not want the Warsaw Ghetto ever to act in a similar way. Quote, we shall not die on our knees. And this from a Jewish socialist leader. People who cling to their lives with superhuman determination, he wrote immediately after the war, were unable to believe that they would be killed in such a manner. Nonetheless, after the war, Bundists like Edelman and Vlad Gamid would be far more likely to present the revolt as a popular demonstration, reflecting a broad cross-section of the entire Jewish public, not just a revolt that was carried out by a small sliver of the population that was armed. Warsaw Ghetto historian and social welfare activist Emanuel Ringelblum, writing in his diary on June 17, 1942, reflected on the passivity of the Jewish masses in the face of destruction after hearing of deportations from Biała Podlaska to Sobibor, and we are left to be led as sheep to a slaughterhouse. He concluded that 3 years of terror had rendered the Jews powerless. Not to act, not to lift a hand against Germans, has since then become the passive, quiet heroism of a common Jew. It's impossible to fight a mass instinct, you must submit to it. And indeed, the Jewish Fighting Organization, which proved powerless to prevent the Great Deportation of July-August 1942 that decimated the ghetto, planned a retaliation against the Jewish police 6 months later, on January 22nd, 1943, calling on the remaining Jews of Warsaw, Jewish masses, the hour is drawing near, you must be prepared to resist, not give yourselves up to the slaughter like sheep. Our motto should be, all are ready to die as human beings. Likewise, in September of 1943, when the United Partisans Organization in Vilna called for armed resistance, Abba Kovner again framed his call in a binary manner. Brothers, he said, it is better to fall in battle in the ghetto than to be led like sheep to Ponari, where Jews were being shot in the outskirts of Vilna. So, when reports began to emerge of the heroic uprising in Warsaw, not the first or the last ghetto to revolt, the Lachva Yisker book, for example, adopted the title Rishonim Lameret, the first to revolt. It was, however, Warsaw was the most famous. It's not surprising that it was seized upon by Jews around the world from all movements. The construction of the myth of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt was directly connected to a Zionist fascination with the so-called revolt at Masada, a revolt that never was, by the way, which we can discuss. Or as David Roskis has noted, more specifically from Yitzchak Lamdan's poem Masada and its refrain, Shenit Metzada lo tipol, Masada will not fall a second time, part of an oath of service that is taken by soldiers inducted into the IDF. Reports emerging from the Warsaw Ghetto framed the choice to engage in armed resistance as proof that Jews could in fact fight for the honor and dignity of the Jewish people. So I'm going to speak more about this tonight, the way in which reporting about the uprising framed the way in which it would be remembered. But you can see here some headlines from May of 1943, the Masada of Warsaw has fallen. The Nazis have set fire to the remnants of the Warsaw Ghetto. And here, a report that was smuggled out of the ghetto in November of 1943, which framed the choice to engage in armed resistance as proof that, quote, Jews could in fact fight for the honor and dignity of the Jewish people. On November 15th, 1943, the surviving members of the Warsaw Jewish Underground sent a report to the World Jewish Congress and to the Polish government in exile that explained, you can see here in the bottom paragraph, fighters belonging to almost all ideological movements took part in brotherly ranks in the fights in the above-mentioned town. Youth of Hechalutz and Hashomer, of the Polei Zion and of the Bund. They were united by a fight not for life but to the death, by the fight for the honor and dignity of the Jewish people. And tonight I'm also going to spend more time talking about, although you can see this framing of fighters from all movements participated in fighting together, the way in which it was immediately politicized as each movement tried to take credit for who actually led the revolt. Even before reports detailing the fighting in the ghetto reached Jews in America and in the Yishuv, they sought to imagine what it must have been like to be in the ghetto and sought interpretations for what the event meant for their own lives. And here you can see this is 6 months after the revolt, lists of names of those who had died in the fighting, also smuggled out to the so-called free world, printed and then published less than a year after the revolt. The first anniversary of the revolt, on April 19th, 1944, saw thousands of Jews gather in New York and London to commemorate the event. A booklet of special prayers and devotions was prepared by the Synagogue Council of America for use in the synagogue and the home. Among the prayers was one to be recited before a moment of silence. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Arise, O God, plead thine own cause. For thy sake are we killed all the day, are we treated as sheep at the slaughter. Now, it's very important to note that in this context, in a religious sense, the trope of, quote, sheep to the slaughter was a point to be celebrated. Jews were willing to show their devotion to God and died to sanctify the name of God, died al Kiddush Hashem. The ghetto fighters would invert this trope, arguing against the passivity of those Jews who allowed themselves to die passively, led like sheep to the slaughter. In remarks at Carnegie Hall on April 19, 1944, so again on the one-year anniversary of the revolt, to mark the first anniversary, the Yiddish playwright Hay Leivik reflected on the meaning of the revolt in Warsaw for Jews in America and indeed for the entire world. The revolt had surely transformed those who lived at the time, filling them with wonder, with fear, and with guilt, and with shame. Leivik stood in awe of the heroism of the fighters, a defiance that also filled him with guilt and anger, for it symbolized the inability of Jews around the world to respond to calls of their brothers for aid, and the indifference of the world to that same cry for help. And it filled him with guilt before the millions of what he described as silent, submissive, and lost Jews, quote, slaughtered like sheep. Now Leivik would, and this, by the way, I'll spend a lot more time on this image tonight. This is an Arthur Schick illustration, again done for the first anniversary of the revolt, in which he tried to imagine who the fighters were in the Warsaw Ghetto. And you can see he depicts here a broad cross-section of the Jewish public, of all different classes joining together to fight. And I'm going to spend more time talking about this. Interestingly, no women depicted here, which by then they knew the names of. It's a boy with payas, the one on the right. Yeah. So, and this is interesting, and I'll spend more time talking about why this happened. But for Leivik, this is again just about a year after the revolt. He writes a play that is put on in New York called "The Miracle in the Ghetto," that celebrated the resolve of a Jewish intellectual to throw off the yoke of Jewish passivity and join the fighting underground. The play, which debuted in New York in October 1944, opens on the eve of Passover, when the revolt broke out, as the remaining Jews trapped in the ghetto prepare for the holiday while waiting for the arrival of weapons with which to fight the Nazis. The first scene is, oops, that's still there. The first scene, just an interesting side note. So this is the cover of the program book that they used for the Miracle of the Warsaw Ghetto, and you can see this image on the front, and they asked Schick to illustrate the cover, and I don't know what happened, or they just borrowed this image that he had done several years earlier to commemorate Tel Chai and the death of the hero, the Jewish hero, Trumpeldor, the one-armed fighter who defended Tel Chai in 1920. But you can see here that they reappropriated that image for their cover image for the Miracle of the Warsaw Ghetto. So just an interesting side note there. In the first scene is set in a basement synagogue where two Jews, Yudel and Leibush, stand immersed in prayer as if in a dream. The stage directions indicate that above the Holy Ark there should be a large banner which proclaims, and you can sort of see it here on the bottom right, Gewalt jeden seid sich nicht meiayish. Woe Jews, do not despair. As the characters in the small shtibel prepare for the first night of Passover, likening their present imprisonment in the ghetto to slavery in Egypt, one character named Isaac asks, why is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights, we let ourselves be led like calves into the gas chambers, but on this Passover night, we will not let this happen. We will shoot. With what will we shoot? With what? Now this is a kasha. This is a question. The play charts the transformation of Jews traditionally unprepared for combat who evolve into realization that their only path is armed struggle. On May 16th, 1944, so again, just about a year after the revolt took place, writing in Davar, the labor Zionist publication in the Yishuv, 1 year after the fall of the ghetto, Yitzhak Greenbaum, the general Zionist leader and head of the Rescue Committee of the Jewish Agency Executive, explained the liberating impact news of the revolt had for Zionist leaders in the Yishuv. When the news reached us about the Warsaw Ghetto revolt, it was as if a heavy stone had been removed from our hearts, which weighed on us all the time. We could not understand why the Jews of Poland, who knew how to fight for their honor in the most recent period, went to their deaths like a lamb to the slaughter, were the German hangmen unable to murder their spirits when they led their bodies to the slaughter, and here the revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto broke out, and here news began to arrive of other battles. For those ghetto fighters who managed to survive the revolt and escape to the Aryan side of Warsaw, it was also critically important that they delivered testimonies and reports so the world would know what had happened. Zionists and Bundists living together in Warsaw, writing the reports to movement leaders outside of occupied Europe. Yitzhak Zuckerman, you can see it here, Tzivi Lebetkin, Mark Edelman, Vlad Gamid, and others would draft testimonies already being written during the war in case they did not survive to record their three lines in history. Until the end of the war, Tzivia, Lebetkin, and Antek Zuckerman hid in Polish Warsaw, serving in the underground and in the rebellion there from August to October 1944. Upon the liberation of Warsaw in January 1945, Zuckerman and Lebetkin stayed behind to begin organizing what was left of the Jewish public. In their immediate post-war testimonies, both Zuckerman and Lebetkin argued that it was the link to the land of Israel that gave them the courage to resist. And here you can see an excerpt in which he describes why he thought Jews were unable to fight back. For Zuckerman, Echalutz, animated by a powerful Zionist ideology and a connection to the land of Israel, inspired the Jewish resistance and stood up to the historic test in a way that the Polish Jewish masses could not. Meanwhile, Tzivi Lebetkin, who left Poland in May of 1946 and arrived in the Yishuv in June, where she provided her extraordinary first-hand testimony to members of the labor movement, the Haganah and the Palmach, upon arrival in Israel. You can see here, so we'll talk more about this tonight as well. This is an obituary that was written for Tzivi Lebetkin and Tosia Altman in May of 1943, after the revolt had been crushed, because they thought that they had both died. So this was published in Davar. Turned out that Tzivia had survived. Tosia had also survived the revolt, but died after the revolt. And actually, this is from a memorial ceremony that was organized to mourn their deaths. As other scholars have written, female fighters like Tzivia Lubetkin and Tosia Altman, in many ways, came to stand in for the death and suffering of millions of Jews in a way that male fighters like Antek and others did not. While Antek would become the leader of the revolt in the absence of Mordechai Nalevich, Tzivia came to represent the sacrifice of the Jewish people, and here I mean the leader in sort of collective memory afterwards. In the case of Tzivia, Lubetkin quite literally came to symbolize rebirth. Although she and Tosia had been eulogized in 1943 after it was believed they had died, here you can see a picture from June 8th, 1946, when she first arrived in the Yishuv, and she symbolically returned to life for those in the Yishuv when she delivered an 8-hour testimony at Kibbutz Yagur, describing the Holocaust for 8 hours straight, explaining how the movement organized the resistance and pulled off the revolt. And here you can see sort of a photo from June 8th, 1946, when she delivered her testimony, and she's there in the middle. I don't know if you can see it in this picture. And again, she argued that perhaps the only thing that sustained us in life was you, the land, the yishuv, the workers' movement, the kibbutz, the home. It was only thanks to you that we stayed alive. After detailing the organization of the resistance and the uprising in Warsaw, as well as other aspects of wartime experience, she concluded her 8-hour-long testimony with 2 observations. She asked the first question, quote, how did it happen that an entire people went like this, necks outstretched to the massacre? Defending the behavior of the Jewish people, she answered, I doubt that any other nation would respond differently under these circumstances of terrible isolation in the entire world against them, the machinery of destruction so organized by the Germans. If we had not been members of the movement, if we had not absorbed from our childhood the values that you gave us, we were able to make the stand that we made in the ghetto because we were a movement, we were a collective, because every one of us knew that he or she was not alone. And you can see here subsequently, her testimony was serialized in Davar HaShavua, and actually in commentary was reprinted in English, describing the final days of the uprising and her escape from the ghetto through the sewers under Warsaw. Later, Lubetkin and Zuckerman would be the driving forces behind the creation of Kibbutz Lochamei HaGetaot, which was opened on the 6th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising on April 19th, 1949. Now, I'll just note before I wrap up that you can see here, so even Bundes fighters like Vlad Kamid, you can see here, this was her identification card, also published their testimonies. This was published in the Vorwärts in serialized form, where she recounted over the course of 6 months her experiences in the Warsaw Ghetto in a series that was called Vladka Speaks, what would later become her memoir on both sides of the ghetto wall. And in her series, she described the organization of the resistance, the revolt, from the perspective of an underground courier for the Bund. And she would eventually be sent by the Jewish Labor Committee for speaking engagements all over the United States and indeed into Latin America as well. It's worth noting, though, that when she concluded her testimony in this 6-month serialized form that was published in the Vorwärts, she concluded with a rebuke for American Jews. She said, where were you, Jews in the free lands, in these horrible times? Why were you silent? This is not any question. This is a reproach. And I'll just note that, in fact, this reproach of American Jewish silence, which echoed the title of Elie Wiesel's first Yiddish version of his memoir, Night, which was originally published as Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world was silence, would never really be answered. And the truth is that actually this was removed from the published version, this rebuke of American Jewry, this sort of idea of silence. And I just want to wrap up with an important coda to this story, which took place in 1961 at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, where Antek and Sivia again were featured prominently in the national spotlight, primarily to offer testimony on the role of the SS in crushing the revolt. And on April 17th, the trial had begun just days earlier, specifically sandwiched in between the timing of Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut, this timing that we are in now in this week. Gidon Hausner delivered his opening indictment, as he said, I'm not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers. And at the trial itself, surviving ghetto fighters like Yitzhak Zuckerman, Tzivi Lebetkin, and Abba Kovner testified at the trial, again seeking to offset the notion that Jews had gone passively to their deaths. I'm going to try to play a brief clip here. We'll see if this works. Just so you can hear Tzivia describing a little bit, although I'm afraid, well, you'll hear her voice, and then I have an English transcript, which will follow it, because I'm afraid the clip that we have does not have English subtitles.
לא הצטרכנו להוציא פקודות, כי הנערים, הבחורים והבחורות האלה, חודשים חיכו לאותו הרגע, בו יוכלו לראות בגרמנים. ואכן הרגע בא. וכשעיר היור, ועמדתי על עלייה בבית הזה, אנחנו עמדנו, 20 וכמה, בחורים ובחורות בית, שאנחנו הכינונו בצורה פרימיטיבית, שצריך להדליק את הפתיל בגפרור ובקבוקי מולוטוב. מוזר היה לראות את 20 וכמה בחורים ובחורות יהודיות עומדים מול האויב המחומש העצום הזה, שמחים ועליזים. למה שמחים ועליזים? ידענו סופם יבוא. ידענו שהם ינצחו אותנו קודם, אבל ידענו שבת חיינו הם ישלמו מחיר יקר.
Okay, I'm gonna, as she details here, and this is not exactly the clip that I played for you, but what did we tell the Jews that night? We told them that anyone who possessed arms should come out to fight, not only the Jewish fighting force, but the ordinary Jews as well who had arms. And we advised those who did not have arms, women, children, and babies, that they should go down into the bunkers, and at the first opportunity of the general confusion, which would arise following the battle, they should go over to the Aryan sector, they should break through and make their way to the forest, and some would survive. And as she also describes, when the moment came, they had very few weapons. This was the part that we were just watching. She describes their primitive ones, the fuse of which had to be lit by the means of a match and Molotov cocktails. It was very strange to see that some Jewish boys and girls confronting this enormous enemy with all their weapons were joyful and merry. This is exactly what we're listening to. Why were they joyful and merry? We knew that our end had come. We knew beforehand they would defeat us, but we also knew they would pay a heavy price for their lives, and indeed they did. There was great rejoicing among us, the Jewish fighters, and behold the miracle. The great German heroes withdrew in tremendous panic in the face of the handmade Jewish hand grenades and bombs. And she describes the joy and satisfaction of seeing German blood indeed flowing in the streets. So during the war, underground groups had labeled the Jewish public as sheep in deploying an extension of the pre-war Zionist worldview, which rejected the passivity of the diaspora Jew to rouse the masses to revolt. And despite their arguments to the contrary, the surviving ghetto fighters sought to explain to themselves and to others why they had waited so long to resist and grappled with the nature of their relationship to the Jewish public. Offering testimonies after the war, surviving ghetto fighters gave meaning to the actions of their comrades who had defended the honor of the Jewish people through their sacrifice, while also trying to explain how it was that the same people could be marched like sheep to the slaughter. For Zionist fighters, the rejection of passivity was made possible through their connection to the land of Israel and the movement's ideology and education. Nonetheless, the deployment of this imagery in the aftermath reinforced the prominence of resistance motifs after the war and minimized the complexity of Jewish behavior while ignoring the experiences of millions of other Jews. The embrace of resistance in the aftermath accomplished two goals. It reinforced the negation of the diaspora, which the Holocaust had already accomplished, and provided meaning to survivors in the aftermath, too. For Jews in Israel, America, and elsewhere, the duality of the revolt and sheep to the slaughter also provided a redemptive narrative that not only helped overcome guilt for silence, but also allowed for the continued popularity of an image that presented Jews as an unthreatening victim and warning to humanity that would prefigure the popularity of Anne Frank and Elie Wiesel. Clearly, the oversimplification of Jewish behavior during the war has conformed to existing Jewish worldviews in Israel and the diaspora that have not seriously questioned how to make sense of the meaning of the event for continued Jewish life in the aftermath. The time has come for a more nuanced understanding of Jewish behavior during the Shoah and for a more nuanced understanding of its impact on the world in which we live. Thank you.
I'm gonna come out from my Zoom webinar cave and say hello and thank Avi for his presentation. We do have a few minutes for questions, and I'll invite those watching on Zoom to send questions as well. My first question for you is, as you know, there's been a debate among historians for a long time as to whether and to what extent Jews in America and refugees and survivors were willing to discuss their experiences of what they had undergone during the Holocaust. So how does your scholarship in looking at the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the immediate years after the war, challenge those perspectives?
Yeah. So before I answer, do you want me to stop sharing this?
Sure.
Okay. So just end the show. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's
okay. Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think one of the interesting things that we can see going on here, and I'll spend some more time talking about this tonight, is this question of why the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising became the focal point as opposed to other experiences during the war, and some of that has to do with the timing of the event, the ways in which Jews wanted to think about themselves, the way in which Jews could present themselves to other either conforming to Zionist ideology or the way they could present themselves to their American neighbors, for example. And one of the things that you see in the privileging of sort of testimonies of resistance and testimonies about ghetto fighters, which are sort of held up on a pedestal, and partisans, those who participate in the fighting, is that the experiences of other Jews are not really focused, do not really become a focal point, right? So certainly in the Yishuv and then in Israel, it is very much sort of an elevation of the ghetto fighters above all else. And then the experiences of most Jews are either diminished or not really a focal point, right? And it's not that Jews, I think, if you go back in and you see sort of testimonies that are being collected, certainly the testimony collection projects that are happening in the displaced persons camps, for example, are collecting, yes, testimonies of ghetto fighters and partisans, but also testimonies of all sorts of other Jews who had lots of other experiences. But part of the issue is that there's not as much of an audience in the both Hebrew reading world and the English reading world and in other sort of parts of the Jewish world for those other experiences. So a perfect example of this is that only recently are we starting to learn more about what was it like to survive the war, let's say in the far reaches of the Soviet Union, right? And we know that actually most of the Jews who ended up surviving and who ended up coming to the displaced persons camps after the war survived and managed to escape to the east, and that's how they survived. But their stories, their experiences were minimized, diminished, indeed for decades. And only now do we have sort of a renewed attention and focus. So you can see that this contributes to what's often been described as kind of a silence that never was. We know now that survivors were talking, the testimonies were being collected, that people were writing about their experiences, but there was less of an interest on the sort of outside world of what those experiences meant.
I'll have a couple of questions. One, to what extent does when they had the option to either go to Israel or the United States immediately after the war, do you think there was a bifurcation in terms of the more demonstrative, the more resisting, more partisan, more activist Jews that would gravitate toward Israel, and the ones that were fatigued and overwhelmed by the experience and wanted a little shalom in their life would move to the United States? Is there any indication of that dichotomy whatsoever? So I have a second question.
Okay, so I'm gonna repeat that in case people on the Zoom couldn't hear the question, which is a really excellent question, which asks about post-war migration essentially, and whether there's some division between sort of the survivors who end up going to either the Yishuv or then the newly created state of Israel, and who are ready for the next battle which is to come, but also the struggles which they will endure, and those who end up in the United States. And I think this is a fascinating question, or the United States and other places, right? Australia and Canada and South America and other places. So it's a fascinating question that is complicated, and I'm gonna tell you why it's complicated. Because if you go to, and this is actually my first book looks at this a lot, Zionism was extremely popular in the displaced persons camps. That is, that if surveys that were done, so the American occupation authorities in post-war Germany, they're trying to figure out how do they deal with this huge refugee crisis. You have hundreds of thousands of survivors who are crowding refugee camps, displaced persons camps. What are we going to do with these people? They're not going to stay in Germany. They don't want to stay in Eastern Europe. Where are we going to put them? So they start doing surveys and trying to figure out, and something like 95% of respondents, when they ask them, where do you want to go? They say, I want to go to the land of Israel, right? On the one hand, that would seem like, okay, that's very clear, but it's actually more complicated than that. That is that the politics of the surviving population, there was almost no other alternative politically, right? There was no organized Jewish labor bund, in the DP camps. It was Zionist parties of all stripes, and then the ultra-Orthodox. And when you dig a little deeper, you find out that a lot of survivors sort of had this division of, first of all, a lot of them would have opted to go to the United States if they had been given the opportunity in 1945, 46, 47. But the United States continued to have very restrictive immigration policy. Really didn't change until 1950, and then so that's where it gets really complicated because, Yehuda Bauer argues about 2/3 of the survivors end up going to Israel. But now more recent research has looked at that of those 2/3, there are quite a few who go to Israel and then leave and come to America. So, what I'm getting at is that it gets super complicated to figure out, and that I think most people after the war, right, there's one of these tragedies that you have a lot of survivors who the only thing that gets them out of Europe and the destruction of the Holocaust is they go to Israel, where they then encounter another war. Some die fighting in 48. Ideology does not motivate migration in most cases. It's other factors, right? So economic opportunity, freedom, chance to start anew, can you get a visa, different things. So that's where it's super complicated to identify, is it one type or another? But survivors, by and large, right, you'll find like a Zionism that will say like 100%, 95% will say we need to have a state of Israel after the war. If there's one conclusion we can draw after the Holocaust is that we need a state of Israel for the Jewish people. I personally might go, live in wherever I can get a visa to, but the Jewish people need a Jewish state. So there's sort of a bifurcation that happens in that way.
Avi, we've got two questions, at least from the Zoom crowd for you. The first is from Nurit. writes, do you think the way that Zelensky resisted the Russian invasion is tied to his Jewish heritage? So a question about Zelensky. And then we have a question for you about Hannah Arendt.
Okay.
And her views on the topic of resistance.
Yeah, so I'll start with Zelensky. Hi, Mom. Thank you for that. This is really interesting to think about. Volodymyr Zelensky, right, as we know, has been, he's invoked the memory of the Holocaust in a lot of different contexts. And when he was going around to different parliaments around the world, he would sort of very, I think, astutely tailor his speech to his audience, right? He's a performer who knows his audience, you have to tailor to your audience. So, when he was in England and he invoked Churchill to sort of talk about, defending Ukraine. And when he, was in Germany, he said, have the words never again lost all their meaning, right? We're sort of facing a complete annihilation. And when he was in Israel and addressed the Knesset over Zoom, he also invoked the Holocaust and said, you know what the final solution is, and we are facing sort of a final solution of the Ukrainian question, something to that effect. So now in Israel, right, this aroused quite a sort of strong response of like, don't use the memory of the Holocaust for these types of political purposes. You can't compare Ukraine to the Holocaust. There's simply no, it's obscene to make a comparison. But it does raise a very interesting question about, we've seen the Shoah, and we're talking about Yom HaShoah today, which on the Jewish calendar, as established by the State of Israel in 1951, right, is the 27th of Nisan, which is the Jewish day today. And it's imploded on the Jewish calendar 1 week before Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. And we know that in sort of Israel's politics and national history, there's a very close connection between we go from Shoah to Tkuma, from destruction to rebirth, to establishment of the state. So we understand sort of in Jewish politics the connection between the Holocaust and the creation of the state. And in the American context, the memory of the Holocaust, Joe Biden, talking about supporting Ukraine, framed it as like one of the lessons of Nuremberg is we have to defend freedom and democracy. That's how Americans tend to talk about it politically. So Zelensky is an interesting case because we've never seen before a Jewish leader of a diaspora nation leading his country in the struggle for freedom and defending democracy invoke the memory of the Holocaust for that purpose, right? So I think 100%, right? I would say, Mom, that it's not just like he is a descendant of survivors. I think that informs his identity, but he hasn't really talked about his Jewish identity that much until now. So we can think about but we all draw on different parts of our identity for different uses at different times. Yep. But he also, I think there is this strong kind of response to knowing what Soviet oppression is like and feeling the echoes of that in the present moment and responding to that. So I think there's a number of factors coming together at the same time for Zelensky. Josh, we were talking about this before, right? Some people are very opposed. I think yesterday the ADL sort of said here on Yom HaShoah, it reminds us again that we shouldn't trivialize the memory of the Holocaust, use it for political purposes. But I wouldn't go that far in the Ukraine case because we're going to find out all sorts of horrible atrocities that have been perpetrated that we don't even know about yet. And I have the words of Latka in the back of my mind, right? Sort of this "why were you silent?" question. I don't think people are being silent, right? But it's also this sense of hopeless, powerlessness of what can you do to make a difference. So I think it's interesting to think about how that the memory of the Holocaust informs our current action. You said there was a Hannah Arendt. Yeah. Just in general about Hannah Arendt.
In general, yeah, Hannah Arendt's views on the subject of armed resistance, sheep to the slaughter.
Yeah. So in the book, what I'll say is that I write about that she goes to cover the Eichmann Trial, and Eichmann in Jerusalem. For those of you familiar, based on her coverage of the Eichmann Trial, where she writes a series for the New Yorker over the weeks and months that she's covering the trial, and then that turns into Eichmann in Jerusalem. And 100%, I mean, she does call out in that piece in very interesting ways the way in which she sees Ben-Gurion politicizing the memory of the Holocaust by creating this dichotomy of active fighters and sheep, and trying to sort of present this lesson for the Israeli public of like, okay, if the time has come now, 15 years after the war, where we're going to learn about the Holocaust, and I'm going to have all these, over 100 survivors testify, and it's this watershed moment. Arendt, I think, observes what's happening, and just says, this is exactly what Ben-Gurion is trying to do. Mm-hmm. He's trying to present this as an object lesson of, this is how Jews should behave, this is not how Jews should behave, right? So, and this then makes its way into Eichmann in Jerusalem. I think, she's, of course, very dismissive of all these other types of Jewish behavior, which now we call spiritual resistance, which get overlooked for a long time because of this dichotomy. So it's, very interesting to think about where she fits into this.
Was there a question over here?
Well, I wonder, as you look at the threats to American democracy today and the level of resistance, if you want to call it that, do you see America being led as lambs?
Yeah. So the question, the question from the audience, for those on the Zoom, if you couldn't hear, was, if we think about this motif of sheep to the slaughter, lambs to the slaughter, and then we think about sort of threats to American democracy in the present moment, can we invoke that, I think, to think about the moment that we're living in? I'll say that the term, so it's what's so interesting to me about sort of the history of this term is, on the one hand, it's so loaded because we just talked about it with this sort of Holocaust analogies. But we see also that has a much longer prehistory that's biblical, right? You could see like Old Testament, New Testament usages, and we have to think about like, what is the implication of using that term, right? The idea of people, like, I'm thinking about the ways in which the term sheep gets used, right? People who passively don't uncritically think about their lives. And look, just in a big picture, like, I think this is, if you think about the powers of conformity, people who, kind of are I don't know about like social media users who are very easily swayed by disinformation, for example, right? Like, I guess my concern is, in terms of using that analogy, what I worry about is if we can separate that analogy from its Holocaust context, because I think there's so many ways in which Holocaust analogies, which is why I think people are a little concerned about using it in the case of Ukraine, Holocaust analogies are misused and appropriated for all sorts of other political reasons. I mean, I think the best and most recent American example is if we think about like in the context of COVID, the pandemic, the anti-masker, anti-vaxxer movement that would sort of use yellow stars to say we are victims, which is an inappropriate analogy and an inappropriate use of that analogy, right? Because it simply doesn't fit. So that's where I like sort of want to make sure that we separate the analogy out from the Holocaust context. But should we be concerned about American democracy? Yes, 100%, 200,000%.
And on that hopeful note, I think we're going to go ahead and conclude the program.
Josh is like, let me go.
Thank you so much to everybody for joining us via Zoom and in person, and thank you again to Dr. Patt. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Okay, thank you, Josh.